Clothing wasn't invented for modesty. It wasn't invented for fashion either. It was invented as a weapon, and the side that lost doesn't exist anymore. For most of human history, we weren't the only humans on Earth, and the disturbing truth is, the invention of clothing may be one of the reasons only one of us is still here. By the end of this video, you'll understand something most people never think about, that a needle, a strip of hide, and a few thousand years of trial and error may have quietly decided which species of human got to inherit the entire planet. Around 60,000 years ago, Europe wasn't empty. It was home to Neanderthals, a species of human, not our ancestor, but our cousin. Thick-bodied, cold-adapted, intelligent enough to control fire, make tools, and bury their dead. They had survived ice ages for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot on the continent. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Their bodies were built like natural insulation, shorter limbs, barrel chests, adaptations that reduced heat loss in extreme cold. By almost every physical measure, they were built for this environment better than we were. Then Homo Sapiens arrived, migrating out of Africa into a world already occupied by a competing form of human. And within roughly 10,000 years, an eye blink in evolutionary time, the Neanderthals were gone. Scientists have debated why for decades. Disease, competition for food, interbreeding, a shrinking and fragmented population, climate collapse, even a massive volcanic eruption, the Campanian ignobite event that some researchers believe blanketed parts of Europe in ash and disrupted ecosystems right around the time of their disappearance. But one theory keeps resurfacing in the research, and it centers on something almost embarrassingly simple: what they wore. Here's where it gets strange. Researchers can't dig up ancient fabric. Cloth rots, it doesn't fossilize. So how do you figure out when humans started wearing clothing at all? You look at lice. In 2003, researchers Ralph Kittler, Manfred Kaiser, and Mark Stoneking studied the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, a separate species that can only survive in the fibers of clothing, not directly on skin. By calculating how long ago these two lice populations split apart genetically, they estimated that humans started regularly wearing clothing around 170,000 years ago. That's not just some humans figured out fur is warm. That's a specific evolutionary turning point, the moment clothing became a permanent, structural part of how our species survived. A new ecological niche for an insect to colonize, essentially, born the moment we started wrapping ourselves in something other than our own skin. But here's the disturbing part. Neanderthals almost certainly wore something too. They weren't naked in the snow. Archaeological sites show evidence of hide processing, stone scrapers used to clean and soften animal skins, worn smooth from repeated use. The difference wasn't whether they wore clothing, it was how. Archaeological evidence from multiple Eurasian sites shows that by around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens weren't just wrapping themselves in hides, they were tailoring them. Fine bone and ivory tools, awls and eyed needles appear at sites associated with modern humans, evidence of piercing, cutting, and stitching multiple pieces of hide into fitted, layered garments that trapped air and sealed out wind. Neanderthal sites, by contrast, show an abundance of scrapers for softening hides, but eyed needles are essentially absent from their toolkits. Their clothing was most likely closer to a draped cloak, effective but loose, with gaps at the joints where cold air and wind could get in. In a mild climate, that difference means very little. In the brutal, swinging cold snaps of the late Ice Age, where temperatures crashed repeatedly over centuries, sometimes within a single human lifetime, that difference can mean who survives a winter and who doesn't. Picture it directly. A woman sits near a fire, a fresh deer hide stretched across her knees. First, she scrapes it, hours of work, pulling a sharpened stone across the underside, removing fat and tissue until the hide is thin enough to bend without cracking. Then comes softening, working the hide by hand, sometimes chewing sections of it, sometimes rubbing it with rendered animal fat until stiff leather becomes something closer to fabric. Only then does the actual sewing begin. A bone awl punctures a line of small holes along the edge. A sinew thread, pulled from the tendons of the same animal, gets pulled through, hole by hole, binding two pieces into one.
It's slow, it's repetitive. A single garment could take days, spread across weeks of a family's time, and every single one of those hours represents a choice. Time spent not hunting, not gathering, not resting, invested instead into a piece of technology that might be the only thing standing between a child and hypothermia 3 months later. This wasn't a side project. For a Homo sapiens family living through the late Ice Age, clothing making was likely one of the central non-negotiable tasks of survival, as important important as finding food and directly tied to whether that food finding could even continue once the temperature dropped. Think about the last time you actually thought about your clothing as survival equipment. For most of us, clothing is disposable, fast fashion, worn twice, forgotten, replaced. We complain about being a little cold walking from a car to a building, then forget about it within minutes. For a Homo sapiens family 45,000 years ago, a poorly sewn seam wasn't an inconvenience. It was a slow, specific way to die. Every stitch mattered. Every layer was tested against conditions almost none of us will ever have to survive ourselves. We didn't just invent clothing, we spent tens of thousands of years perfecting it under a level of pressure most of us will never understand, where a bad decision about how to cut a hide wasn't a fashion mistake, it was a fatal one. Here's something that surprises most people. The clothing gap theory isn't standing alone. Researchers studying Neanderthal extinction have pointed to a whole cluster of small technological and behavioral differences, all pointing the same direction, that Homo sapiens weren't smarter in some abstract sense, but were consistently better at one thing, building layers of protection between themselves and a hostile environment. Sewn clothing was one layer, but there's evidence of others. Homo sapiens sites show more complex, structured shelters, evidence of deliberately organized living spaces, including what may be windbreaks and partial enclosures. Personal ornaments, pierced shells, beads, pigments like ochre appear far more frequently at Homo sapiens sites, which some researchers interpret as evidence of larger, more connected social networks. Bigger networks meant more people to share resources, knowledge, and technology with when things went wrong. A recurring cold snap that might wipe out an isolated group of 30 Neanderthals might be survivable for a network of Homo sapiens spread across dozens of connected groups, trading ideas, tools, and quite possibly clothing techniques over long distances. In other words, this almost certainly wasn't a single invention that changed everything overnight. It was death by 1,000 small advantages, compounding generation after generation until one population had a margin for error the other simply didn't. It's worth pausing here because clothing isn't the only explanation on the table, and a fair account of this mystery means looking at the competition. The interbreeding and absorption theory suggests Neanderthals didn't so much go extinct as get gradually folded into a larger, expanding Homo sapiens population, outnumbered generation after generation until their distinct genetic and cultural identity simply dissolved. The population size theory points to something colder and more mathematical. Even small differences in birth rate or infant survival, compounded across thousands of years, can drive a smaller population to extinction with no dramatic single cause at all, just unfavorable math repeated relentlessly. The disease theory suggests that Homo sapiens migrating out of Africa may have carried pathogens Neanderthal immune systems had never encountered, similar in principle to what happened to indigenous populations in the Americas thousands of years later, though direct evidence for this in the Paleolithic record is much harder to confirm. And the climate catastrophe theory points to that Campanian ignimbrite eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in Europe in the last 200,000 years, as a possible final blow to an already struggling population. Most researchers today believe the real answer isn't any single one of these, it's some combination. A population already under pressure from climate and competition, absorbed and outcompeted at the same time, with technology like clothing as one meaningful piece of a much larger, messier picture. And this is where the theory turns genuinely unsettling. Researcher Ian Gilligan, who has studied the link between Ice Age climate shifts and Neanderthal extinction, argues that as European temperatures became more extreme and unpredictable during this period, the ability to produce tailored, insulating clothing wasn't a luxury, it became a decisive survival advantage. Homo sapiens groups with sewn, layered clothing could move into colder territory, hunt longer through harsh seasons, and survive temperature crashes that Neanderthal groups, still relying on simpler, draped hides, increasingly could not. It's not that Neanderthals were less intelligent or less capable. Some researchers argue that a handful of specific technologies, the sewing needle chief among them, may have quietly tipped an entire competition between two human species that had coexisted in various forms for hundreds of thousands of years. Clothing didn't just help us survive the cold, it may have helped us outlast the only other humans who ever stood beside us. But here's a detail that complicates the story in a strange, almost tender way. We didn't just outcompete Neanderthals, we interbred with them. Genetic studies, including landmark sequencing work led by paleogeneticist Svante Pääbo, who later won the Nobel Prize for this research, have shown that most people with non-African ancestry today carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some of those inherited genes are directly linked to skin and hair, traits that may have helped early Homo sapiens populations adapt more quickly to colder, less familiar environments outside Africa by borrowing adaptations Neanderthals had already spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving. So, in a strange way, even as one population's technology may have outcompeted the others, we ended up carrying pieces of them forward inside us. They didn't just disappear. Parts of them are quite literally still walking around today, folded into almost every non-African person's genome. It complicates the idea of a clean winner and loser. It was closer to two populations colliding, merging in places, competing in others, and only one of them keeping the name. Here's the uncomfortable question all of this leaves behind. Somewhere in a cave 45,000 years ago, someone sat with a bone needle and a strip of hide, pulling thread through leather by firelight, with no idea that what they were making might help determine which species of human would still be standing tens of thousands of years later. They weren't thinking about legacy, they weren't thinking about competition or survival of the species or evolutionary advantage. They were thinking about tomorrow's cold, about whether the wind would get through the gap at the shoulder again tonight. And maybe that's the real disturbing part. The difference between a species that continues and a species that vanishes isn't always a dramatic war or a single catastrophic event. Sometimes it's not even a decision anyone consciously made. Sometimes it's just a needle, used or not used by the fire, repeated 10,000 times by 10,000 different hands across 10,000 different winters until the smallest advantage became an unbridgeable gap. It's worth sitting with how strange this really is. We tend to imagine extinction as something loud, a war, a plague, a meteor. But the disappearance of the Neanderthals looks more and more like something quieter, a slow accumulation of small technological gaps, each one survivable on its own, compounding across thousands of years until an entire population simply couldn't keep pace anymore. It's a sobering reminder that the biggest turning points in our history rarely announce themselves. No one alive 45,000 years ago knew they were living through the final chapter of another species' existence. They were just trying to get through winter. That's the recurring theme. Whether we're talking about clothing, fire, shelter, or food, the biggest evolutionary stakes were almost always hiding inside the smallest, most mundane daily decisions. So the next time you put on a jacket without thinking twice, remember that somewhere in your ancestry, someone's survival and maybe an entire species' extinction came down to whether their clothes were good enough to survive the night. We didn't just learn to dress ourselves. We may have outdressed the only other humans who ever existed alongside us, and in a strange, quiet way, through the small percentage of Neanderthal DNA most of us still carry, we ended up wearing a little bit of them too.